Hello, everybody. Good to be back with you again, even in this recorded format. And I am going to start today where I promised I would go last week, and then we got sidetracked by the discussion of the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict. I will just mention very briefly that we had a verdict in the Ahmaud Arbery case last week, or I guess the middle of this week, and obviously a very different verdict, a very different fact scenario, but I think in certain respects very reassuring about the fact that there's simply not impunity to use violence to maintain racial hierarchy in the 21st century in the United States. And in a sense, the conflicting or disparate verdicts in the Rittenhouse and Arbery decisions, coupled with, of course, the decision in the Derek Chauvin George Floyd case, suggests that our law as our society is conflicted, roiled, moving in two different directions at once. And this is, in a sense, as we should expect it to be. This is progress, and progress is neither uniform nor fast in the complicated world of politics and law. Having said that, I'm not going to speak about those topics today. I'm going to focus where I said I would on taking a longer term perspective on American politics and alternating between the long and the short term. And the reason I want to do this is to suggest that there are some important causes, grounds for a certain degree of optimism in contemporary American politics, and that I, in particular, am guilty of not paying perhaps sufficient attention to that on a regular basis. And I want to try to correct that a little bit for you today. But having said that, I do think that those long-term trends are subtle and certainly not dominant yet. And that in addition to the long-term trends, we do have a whole bunch of immediate stuff that is cause less for hope than for dismay. And so I want to try to balance those two out. To begin with, and this was the other big piece of news in the last week, a week ago, that I didn't really have time to speak about last week. As you are no doubt aware, this huge kitchen sink reform bill passed the House of Representatives, and it's another testimony to Nancy Pelosi's remarkable accomplishments as a legislator, as a manager of her chamber, the House of Representatives, that she was able to get this through on such a narrow margin with a single Democratic defection, right? And obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but as it turns out, no Republican support whatsoever. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time dwelling on the details here. There's an awful lot in this bill that would be transformative. And I want you to see that the largest single piece of it is support for families, in particular for childcare and universal pre-K and paid family leave. There's an awful lot also for the environment, in particular, transitioning our grid and our energy system, supporting cleaner and electric vehicles, and there's a fair bit in housing as well. But without going into those details, because this legislation is going to the Senate, and it's almost certainly going to be negotiated and cut back in the Senate, I do anticipate that some version of it will ultimately pass the Senate, and then there'll have to be some kind of negotiation between the House and the Senate, but that it will ultimately pass. I have to be clear that there's no guarantee that that will happen, but it seems quite likely, and it would be an awful self-inflicted wound for the Democrats to fail to pass this legislation and although Manchin and Sinema, whose names, as I say, we're going to tire of repeating again and again and again, are strong-headed and independent people. They're going to no doubt hold out for changes in this legislation. I don't see them as so obstructive that they're going to completely prevent some version of this legislation from passing. And then once it's passed, the Biden administration and the Democrats will have passed three major pieces of legislation, right? A coronavirus relief act totaling nearly $2 trillion, a infrastructure bill totaling over $1 trillion, a Build Back Better bill or safety net bill, the price tag of which may be somewhere around $2 trillion. So it'll be by far and away the largest expansion in the federal government, the largest price tag on a series of legislation passed in the first year of a new president in a couple generations. You really have to go back to Johnson to find something of this scope, this ambition. And not only that, and I need to emphasize two aspects of this. I think the first is that the benefits will, in large part, redound to the people who have done least well in our economy over the last 50 to 70 years, the people who have been left out of the wealth creation in the new post-industrial information economy. And I think that's extraordinarily important for the long-term prospects of the Democrats and this kind of legislation and assembling the kind of coalition necessary to open new possibilities in American politics. If a substantial fraction of those who are doing less well off see the federal government ultimately as benefiting them, as on their side, as allied with their interests, and as supportive of their political identity, then new possibilities for future legislation open. And so that's one aspect of this I want to strongly emphasize. The second aspect, and I've emphasized this in previous lectures, is that the coalition, right, that passed this legislation is almost entirely Democratic. And if I should say it's basically exclusively Democratic at this point. And if you look at the composition of the members of the House of Representatives in the Democratic caucus, they are pretty much a mirror image of America in terms of their racial demography. And the reason I emphasize that is because, as I've tried to make clear to you in previous lectures, every other major expansion of the federal government in American history has benefited exclusively or nearly exclusively white Americans. And again, I don't think that will be the case this time. I'm quite certain that will not be the case this time. We already are seeing some of these benefits, like the child tax credit, being implemented in a non-discriminatory way. And then the other possibility that success with this kind of legislation opens is for the idea of a multiracial coalition, a multiracial form of democracy being good for everyone. And that's really where I want to start today. In the idea that both the changing demographics of our country and, in certain respects, the changing politics of our country open for us new possibilities for multiracial democracy, multiracial cooperation, and ultimately a more cooperative, humane society, a society with a better provision of public goods by the government, a society that therefore becomes less competitive, less mean, less noxious in its politics. So let me then introduce to you again the sources that I'm going to be drawing on in these lectures, and it'll just be 2-3 lectures to bring these topics into focus for you. And so 2 important recently published books, both published within the last year. One of them I've spoken with you a little bit about before, Heather McGhee's The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. And as I've mentioned, right, McGhee is the former head of the policy research group, Demos, headquartered out of New York City. And she started there as an intern, worked her way up, went to UC Berkeley and got a law degree, and then came back to head it. And she took off time from heading Demos to go on a trip across country to do research. And her book is chock full of narratives, of stories that help us to understand both the costs of non-cooperation, and so the enemy in her book, the cancer of American politics, is zero-sum thinking, the idea that what is good for them is bad for us, and vice versa, right? And that the way in which we escape zero-sum thinking, thinking that there is a necessary competition between interests, especially between racial groups. And so to be specific, what is good for Black people, what is good for Latinos or brown people, what is good for Asian Americans, what is good for non-white people, most broadly speaking, is necessarily bad for white people, and therefore we have to resist policies, measures that might be good for them. And by the way, the federal government for most of the last 50 years has been on their side, not our side, so we need to be skeptical of the federal government in general. That's the position that she believes has hampered American politics, that makes our society a less generous, a meaner, a more competitive, a less secure place to live. And she sees, as she travels the country, example after example of communities escaping that way of thinking and benefiting. And so she sees an alternative future for America already taking shape on the ground. And again, I think this is not yet transforming our national politics, though there are signs that it may be beginning to. And so the alternative to zero-sum politics is positive-sum politics, as opposed to what's good for them being bad for us and vice versa. We can, by working together, create things that are good for all of us, that expand the pie, as they say, so that each of us can take a larger slice, so that we don't have to view the size of my slice as taking away from the size of your slice. And to be as concrete about this as possible, then we are talking about all kinds of public policy that provide forms of opportunity, whether that be in the form of education or job training or assistance in acquiring or providing housing, as well as forms of security, whether that be in healthcare or unemployment insurance or retirement insurance, that if they become more generous can benefit all of us collectively together. But in order to get it, we're going to have to come together to cooperate, to demand and create those kinds of programs. All right, so that's a little bit more of an introduction to Heather McGhee. I'm about to go into more detail on her book, but before I do that, I want to introduce you again to Robert Putnam, one of the most eminent, one of the most eminent political scientists in America today, the author of the most wide-selling book in political science of the last 20 years, Bowling Alone. And recently the author of The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. And as I think I've pointed out to you, the cover has a fair bit of the message of the book in it. The I and the we are in red, and the graph on the cover is actually going from 1890 to 2020, and it actually condenses a whole bunch of trends into one single curve, trends to do with economic equality or inequality, political cooperation or competition, polarization, social networking and the building of an associational life, and also psychology, whether or not we see ourselves more as connected to each other and cooperative with each other, or competitive and disconnected, alienated from each other. And so the way he expresses this overall curve, and it starts in 1890 and goes to 2020, and up is positive and down is negative. And so in the Gilded Age, we started out highly unequal, very polarized, low levels of participation in our civic life, and rather narcissistic and alienated psychologically. And then over the first half of the 20th century, we moved up, and then we stayed up in a high plateau for the middle of the 20th century, generally speaking, all the way through the 1970s or 1980s. But then we began to move back down. And now, in terms of our levels of inequality, our degree of polarization, our civic privatism or withdrawal from associations, and our more competitive, self-centered psychology, we have in many ways reverted to where we were 125 years ago. And so Putnam refers to this overall curve, which he thinks subsumes a number of different trends, as an I, we, I curve, right? And so at the beginning of the 20th century, we were much more individualistic. In the middle of the 20th century, we were more solidaristic and cooperative. And at the end of the 20th century, we were again more individualistic, continuing into the present era. And so his claim is that it is when we come together that we achieve greater equality, that we depolarize our politics, that we build a rich associational life, that we, in so doing, manage to find value in cooperating with each other and be drawn out of our individualism into solidarity. And I hope you can hear the deep resonances between these two books. It's why I wanted to pair them. And one of the things that I think Putnam is doing in expanding, in a sense, the time frame of his work from the middle of the 20th century, when things were better, right? We tend to tell a story of decline. And if we go back to the Gilded Age and to the progressive era of the 1890s into the 1920s, we can then tell the story of ascent as well, right? The story that says we are doing better, right? Or we were able to do better because we came together and found ways to cooperate. And so one of the reasons to tell that story is not only to say, look, there were things that worked in the 1890s and 1910s and 1920s that ultimately we reaped the profits from in the middle of the 20th century. But and so we can learn those lessons and replicate that success in the 21st century if we learn those lessons and are successful at emulating them. But also, and this is, I think, critical, that in the 1890s, 1910s, 1920s, when in fact you were beginning an upswing, it may not have been visible, right? It only becomes visible in retrospect. And so part then of the lesson, I think, of Putnam's book is that we may in fact do well, not only to try to replicate the successful politics of the early 20th century in the early 21st century, but we might look around us and see whether we've already perhaps begun to do that, even if we're not bearing fruit yet. And so in a sense, I don't think they were aware that they were each writing similar books, but maybe Heather McKee did some of the work that Putnam is suggesting by going on her journey cross country and finding places where cooperation is already occurring and already bearing fruit. All right, so as I think I may have mentioned a week ago, McGee's book doesn't have any diagrams, right? And you know me, I like my diagrams. And so I've had to search to find some diagrams that illustrate the points from McGee's book. And I'm going to start with this diagram. And this is very similar to a finding that McGee reports. It's not her finding, but the diagram I know takes a little bit of time to make sense of. But the metric here is, I'm sorry, on the vertical axis going up and down, is do you support government services and spending, right? And the further up you are on that scale, the more likely you are to support government spending, right? And the metric here is the degree of either racial resentment or economic peril that people report. And so in the middle is neutral, no economic peril, or basically, I don't feel particularly friendly, but I don't feel particularly hostile to other racial groups. And then the further up you go, the higher the level of economic peril and the higher the level of racial resentment, right? And those are two different categories. They don't overlap. They're just measured on a similar scale. And what you can see here is that one finding you might expect would be that as economic peril goes up, support for the government would go up. And in fact, we do see that, but it's very modest, right? And that is, in a sense, on McGee's account, one of the real problems with American politics. And it's not just her account alone. I think a number of scholars that I've spoken with you about over the course of a long time agree that one of the really baffling features of American politics is that at least many of the people who would benefit most from expanded federal governmental programs oppose them most, right? And so these are the people who are showing high levels of economic peril. And As you can see, as the level of economic peril goes up, you just get into the positive, slight positive territory in terms of supporting government. But having said that, I think the sharper curve, and so the more dramatic correlation here is between racial resentment and support for the government. And so what you see here is that as you go up the scale of racial resentment, do you feel antagonism to other racial groups? Do you feel like government benefits them but not you? Do you feel like government is unfairly advancing the situation of other racial groups and neglecting yours? The more racially resentful you are, the less you support federal government. And on the other hand, if you have the opposite sentiment, if you in fact have warm or cooperative feelings to other racial groups, what you see is high levels of support for the federal government, federal spending, federal programs, much higher, right, than you see even with those with the highest levels of economic peril. And so this then begins to, I think, illuminate American politics. And here McGee is suggesting, again, not her diagram, but I'll read to you a passage from her in just a moment, that in a sense, people who experience, and now we can bring the variables together, economic peril and racial resentment, end up emphasizing their racial resentment more than their economic peril, and so do not support programs that would benefit them, right? And so let me quote a couple passages to this effect from McGee's book. The first one is on page 30 of The Sum of Us. She says, quote, I found that white people with high levels of resentment against Black people have become far more likely to oppose government spending generically. As of the latest ANES data in 2016, there was a 60-point difference in support for increased government spending based on whether you were a white person with high versus low racial resentment. Government, it turned out, had become a highly racialized character in the white story of our country. When the people with power in a society see a portion of the populace as inferior and undeserving, their definition of the public becomes conditional. It's often unconscious, but their perception of the other as undeserving is so important to their perception of themselves as deserving that they'll tear apart the web that supports everyone, including them. Public goods, in other words, are only for the public we perceive to be good. And if that means, right, that you can't benefit yourself without also benefiting those who you view as undeserving, in contrast to you, or if in order to maintain your idea of yourself as particularly and differentially deserving, I'm one of those good people who contributes, not like those other people who just take, right? I'm a striver, not a taker, as we hear in the language today. Then you will pursue policies that, in a sense, punish yourself in order to also punish the other group. That's the core idea here. Let me quote just one more passage, this time from page 38 of the book. She says, racism then works against non-wealthy white Americans in two ways. First, it lowers their support for government actions that could help them economically out of a zero-sum fear that it could help the racialized undeserving as well. And I hope that's clear, but let me stop and unpack that for a second, right? The idea here is if you put in place equality promoting policies, policies that raise the bottom, right? That help people who are currently economically insecure or experiencing economic peril to gain in economic security, you may raise the bottom so that the difference between the group one step up from the bottom and the bottom is diminished. And if you define yourself against the group at the bottom, right, we are better than them, we are superior to them. And that's important to your thinking, that you have an elevated status in this society, then you're not going to support those policies that raise you, but might in so doing decrease the difference between you and the people below you. And I'm being abstract, I know, but if we talk about this in terms of race, right? If poor white people worry that making public health available, public health insurance available to everyone, or unemployment insurance, or job training, or better educational opportunity available to everyone might allow Black or brown people to increase their status in our society and then decrease the difference between them, that could be very threatening to them. And as she says, this is often not conscious. They're not necessarily formulating the position in this way, but it does seem to be very much at work in our politics. So let me now continue with the passage, right? We're talking about two ways in which racism works against non-wealthy white Americans. The first is that zero-sum way of thinking. She says, yet racism's work on class consciousness is not total. There are still some New Deal type economic policies that the majority of white Americans support, like increasing the federal minimum wage and raising taxes on the wealthy. But the racial polarization of our two-party system has forced a choice between class interest and perceived racial interest. And in every presidential election since the Civil Rights Act, the majority of white people chose the party of their race. That choice keeps the conservative faction in power that blocks progress on the modest economic agenda they support. And again, I want to try to be as clear as possible about this. Policy issue by policy issue by policy issue, Americans are generally speaking relatively liberal, right? This is part of the irony with the Build Back Better agenda. I'll just go back to this diagram here. Almost everything in this legislation has favorable poll ratings, not just favorable, 70, 80% of the people say they support this item by item. And yet, many people, maybe even a majority right now, oppose this legislation. And they oppose this legislation despite supporting all of its elements. And why do they oppose it? Because they see this as a major expansion of federal government power, as tax and spend liberalism, right? And the issue here is that when they frame it that way, they don't think that it's the kind of politics that they should support, even if they support every measure included in this bill, right? And this then is the double irony, the conundrum that McGee is pointing out, which is that as a society, we have not supported this kind of legislation. We, and especially the poorest among us, but really the bottom 2/3 of our society in many respects suffer because we don't. I'll just point out to you what I've said to you many times before, which is that having a child in 21st century America is the event that is most likely to tip a family or an individual into poverty, right? And obviously having federally subsidized childcare would be extremely important to allowing working parents to have children and also to continue to participate in the workforce. Having a child tax credit, $200 to $300 per child per month, we've already seen this implemented as a result of the coronavirus stimulus package that was passed in March of this year. And we've seen child poverty go down by 60%, almost 2/3 in our society, right? This is stuff that would be dramatically beneficial in the short term for many Americans. I've got to be careful here, because when you look at, a rapid expanse in federal subsidy for childcare, in the short term, it could also create a shortage of childcare, more competition for childcare. This will take some time and some care, and there may be some bumps in the road to implement, but ultimately this will benefit so many of the people who are experiencing high levels of economic insecurity and peril in 21st century America. And yet many of them are not supporting it because racial resentment undermines support for the federal government. All right, so continuing just for a moment then to think about what's happening in American politics, I want to point out that Trump, right, and the Trump takeover of the Republican Party has made the Republican Party a vehicle for the expression of racial resentment in American politics. And McGee is referring to that, right, in the passages I just read out to you. One party, the Republican Party, and particularly, right, this book is researched in the Trump era, published in 2020. The Republican Party has become the party that legitimates and serves as a vehicle for the politics of racial resentment, ethnic antagonism, hostility. And again, this diagram, which again, I know these diagrams, that this is probably why McGee doesn't have diagrams in her book, is they're not transparent. But again, what this diagram shows is hostility to four groups: African Americans, Hispanics, Muslims, and LGBTQ people, right? And it looks at the level of hostility that people felt to those groups in 2011 to identify them, and then sees who they're supporting in 2017, right? And what she finds is that there's a negative correlation, right? That the people who are least hostile are most likely to support Democrats. The people who are most hostile show the least support for Democrats, but not a strong positive correlation with Republicans other than Trump or Trumpian Republicans, right? And so you can see that here. But when it comes to high levels of hostility and support for Trump, there's a very strong correlation. And so as the Republican Party, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, has become a much more explicit vehicle for the politics of racial resentment, the idea that racial resentment is going to hamper support for the kinds of bills that would really benefit those who are least well off in our society, the Republican Party is going to resist that kind of legislation has become all the more clear, right? And I've pointed this out to you before. I don't think I need to dwell here, that the people who are most likely to say that the election was stolen, that we might want to use violence to overturn its results or to save or restore American democracy, are also the people who are most likely to endorse the so-called Great Replacement theory, right? The idea that, and this is classic zero-sum politics, that African American and Hispanic people will have more rights than whites, that somehow the gain in status, the movement toward what I think is objectively characterized much better as legal equality, is a zero-sum trade-off, because African Americans now have equal rights, because Latinos are gaining equal rights. We are going to see a decline in white people's rights, white people's privilege, white people's status within our society. They will be not just sharing, collaborating as equals, but replaced. I now want to move into the positive side of the story. And to do this, I'm going to start by going back to a diagram and a couple of them actually that I take from Ryan Enos's book, The Space Between Us. And if you remember, this is a book on social and political geography in which Enos, Harvard University political scientist, doing really, I think, very interesting work at the intersection of political geography and political psychology. Enos suggests that the fact that America is a highly segregated society, and that in many ways we are as segregated today as we were before the Brown v. Board decision. We are geographically segregated in terms of our residential living patterns. And the result is that our schools are also highly segregated, and our social institutions, our churches, our clubs, etc., tend to be highly segregated. He points out, not going to go too much into the detail here, but that if you live in urban America, you probably have a pretty strong sense of where you belong and where you don't belong in your city, in your neighborhood, and that there's a strong racial component to that, right? And so if we are segregated in geographical space, right? And he imagines that there's group B and group A. Group A is more numerous, but they actually are both quite numerous. They're proximate to each other, but segregated from each other, that this opens up in human psychology naturally, unselfconsciously. It's just part of the way in which our cognitive architecture translates the experience of geographic segregation into social categories. We tend to assimilate all of the A's into one kind of group and all of the B's into another kind of group. And by the way, another really deep-seated tendency in human psychology is if you are a member of group A, you want to think that there are good attributes in your group, because of course that applies to you. One way to shore up your sense that all A's are good is to contrast yourself with the members of group B and to say, we in group A are honest and hardworking and tax paying and deserving, but don't ask for handouts. Whereas in contrast, those members of group B, they're dishonest, they're criminal, they're lazy, they just want handouts from the government, right? And so not only do you assimilate all the diverse members of the different groups into one or two big stereotypes, you also then attach negative and positive attributes to your own group and the other group. And this then tends to open up political space. All A's vote for this party and all B's vote for that party, and social space. They belong over there, we belong over here. We're this kind of people, they're that kind of people, right? And so this is background, right? This is part of the reason I think that McGee suggests that race is playing such an important role in American politics, but I think it's also important to illuminating part of the hopeful findings in her research. So let me now move to a second diagram from Enos, and this is again not easy to unpack, but I think it's pretty straightforward once you begin to understand what's going on. And he has two variables that interact with each other on this diagram. As you move from left to right, you have greater what he calls social geographic impact. And that refers to the combination of there being two groups that are relatively large, two or more groups, but sizable groups, not just a small, tiny, imperceptible number of people, but a large enough group that you'll form a stereotype of them, that are living in close proximity to each other, but that are segregated from each other, right? And on the other hand, interpersonal contact. And what this diagram essentially shows, so as you move up, you have greater interpersonal contact. And what this diagram shows is that interpersonal contact, especially sustained interpersonal contact, not just like riding the same bus with someone, but having a conversation with them, can undo some of the effects of stereotyping, right? And so that there is a trade-off between interpersonal contact and social geographic impact. But, oh, I'm sorry. The thing to notice is that generally speaking, social geographic impact is stronger, right, than interpersonal contact. That's what the shading is meant to indicate. Even if you have high interpersonal contact, if you're up here with high also social geographic impact tends to outweigh. It's almost as dark up here as it is down there, right? It's only in areas where you have greater interpersonal contact and less segregation that you begin to have positive interaction with racial others. And very quickly, Ryan Enos is the one who conducts that experiment where he finds a all-white suburb of Boston and puts a couple young Mexican-American men on the train, the same commuter train that has the same passengers on it every day, and has them speak loudly in Spanish. And the white commuters riding that train, he does survey research. This is in 2016 in the buildup to the election that eventually gives us Donald Trump as the president. He finds that the people on that train initially, when the Mexican Americans are riding the train and speaking in Spanish loudly, they initially increase their support for Trump. They initially increase their support for building a border wall. They decrease their support for a path to citizenship for dreamers. They become more conservative and more anti-immigrant. He also finds, Ryan Enos, after they've been on the train for a while, give them a few weeks, those anti-immigrant sentiments start to come back down. And he interviews the people and he says, look, turns out these guys are just ordinary guys and they're actually quite friendly. They'll give up their seat for someone, etc. I don't need to be so alarmed that they're invading my neighborhood and maybe about to take it over, right? And so contact can mitigate the effects of segregation. That's, I think, essential background to understanding what is happening in the United States today. In a sense, we are on the commuter train from suburban Boston. The country as a whole, as this diagram shows, has become more diverse over the last decade. The arrows that are blue are census tracts where the 2020 census shows the United States is becoming more diverse. You can also see a few red arrows, but they're vastly outnumbered by the blue arrows. The red arrows are census tracts where the country has become whiter. And if we begin to drill down, look at this in overall statistics, what we can see is that from 2010 to 2020, what people had predicted would occur has in fact occurred. The United States is becoming less dominantly white, primarily because Hispanic and Asian American populations are growing. And this is then transforming many areas in the United States, especially mid-sized cities, especially in the South. Dallas, Atlanta, Orlando, Austin, New Orleans started 2010 as majority white cities. By the time we got to 2020, they were either 50-50 or majority minority cities. This is true of Sacramento as well, the last major city in California in 2010 that was majority white. So actually, I take that back. San Francisco is another such city. This is then changing the face of the United States, changing us in the way that Eno's experiment suggests. He sometimes calls this the Arizona effect. And the result is that many white Americans are feeling that worry, that concern, that they are no longer the majority group in their neighborhood, in their workplace, in their school. And they've taken that for granted and they're worried that they're going to be replaced. But I want to be as clear as possible, right? There's very good evidence that, in fact, what is occurring is not exclusively segregation, right? This is evidence of integration. And one sign of integration of the largest growing group demographically, Latinos, is the fact that they're growing rapidly in English language proficiency to the point where those who have English language proficiency exceed those who speak Spanish at home. And by the way, I think one of the things that I should share with you is that the vast majority of increase in Latinos in the United States does not come from immigration. It comes from differential birth rates of the people who are already in this society. And so we have a large number of US born Latinos increasing, and they are, I'll say, of course, fluent in English, right? And so you can see 91% English proficiency and smaller and smaller proportions speaking Spanish at home. That is different for those who are foreign born. When we look at the levels of segregation in our society, it is still the case, right, that we are a segregated society. In many categories, we are less segregated in 2020, or as we approach 2020 with this data, than we were in 2000, right? And so whites are less segregated. They used to live in neighborhoods that were 79% white, despite the fact that they were only 64% of the population. Now their neighborhoods are 71% white. And as you can see, there's a genuine array of diversity even in dominantly white neighborhoods. African Americans are living in better integrated neighborhoods as well, right? Instead of 52% Black, they've moved to 44% Black. Now, when it comes to Latinos and Asians, the trend lines are not nearly so clear. It looks like Latinos are still living in neighborhoods that are 50% Latino, essentially 46, 47, 2019, despite the fact that they are 15 or 21% of the population. And Asian Americans as well are living in neighborhoods that are slightly more Asian than they were, but these are among the best integrated people in the United States. And so all of that to say there's indications that we're becoming more diverse and more integrated, and that this will eventually transform America in terms of the amount of contact that people will have across racial lines. And we are seeing this already reflected in some polling data, for instance, about how accepting people are of the growing diversity of the United States. And part of what we see here, right, is that in general, Americans from 2016 to 2020 went from mainly thinking, or at least the more people thinking that growing diversity was a bad thing than thought that it was a good thing. The majority are in all of these categories, in fact, not willing to commit one way or another, or perhaps indifferent, right? That they say it's neither good nor bad. But in 2016, 22% said it was a bad thing, 14% said it was a good thing. In 2020, 24% say it's a good thing, and only 11% say it's a bad thing. As you can see, there is polarization on this. The number of Republicans who say it's a bad thing that the United States is becoming more diverse still outnumber maybe 2 to 1 the numbers who say it is a good thing, but that's much better than 10 to 1, which is where it was in 2016. The number of Democrats who say it's a good thing outnumber the number, or the group that says it's a bad thing, 10 to 1, as opposed to maybe 3 to 1 in 2016. So some evidence already that our racial antagonism is diminishing as our demography and geography are transforming. And this is shown in white attitudes on immigration for all groups except for white conservatives, who remain very critical of immigration. White liberals have moved over the last 25 years from being quite critical to being really quite accepting of immigration. White moderates have moved dramatically in the same direction, although they still are in a plurality, thinking that it is a critically important and perhaps dangerous issue. And so let me then conclude for today by talking about two models of politics that I hope this data helps us to see, and that McGee, I think, brings very sharply into focus. One of them is a politics of maintaining white status superiority. And to be clear, this basically says we're not going to support the Build Back Better bill. We're not going to support expanded federal government power in general, because that's going to blur the lines between us and them. It's going to benefit the Black and Brown and Asian people in getting ahead of us in line on the way to the American dream. And I want to be as clear as possible. There are two kinds of costs to this. One of them is the high collective cost. As McGee says again and again, look, we just don't have the kinds of things that you would expect a highly developed society like ours to have. whether we're talking about infrastructure, whether we're talking about healthcare, whether we're talking about the investment in education or educational outcomes, whether we're talking about the level of support for people who find themselves unemployed or in retirement, it's just not as good to live here as it is to live in almost every other developed society in the world. And so the idea that divide and conquer politics built on status competition prevents us from getting so much that would be good, means that there's a high collective cost for all of us. But in addition, I want to be as clear as possible about this. White people in particular seem to be paying a very high cost for the politics of maintaining status inequality. Jonathan Metzl's title to his book, Dying of Whiteness, brings this home. I've spoken with you before about the deaths of despair literature and the high rates of suicide, drug overdose, alcoholism, anxiety-induced heart disease that are shortening life expectancy for white people in our society. And that this is part of this psychology of saying we're deserving, so we don't want support from our government. It leads people to then blame themselves when they don't succeed. The alternative is the idea of multiracial cooperation, that kind of coalition politics that I think we're beginning to see transform the Democratic Party and may ultimately be seeing signs, McKee finds lots of them, that it's transforming local politics in the United States already. And what Putnam adds to this picture is, just as with the progressive movement, progress started at the local and state level, and that it wasn't until various policies actually succeeded at the local and state level that the federal government began modeling its policy on successful experiments that had been introduced at the sub-federal level, the level of the state or the locality. I think we're beginning to see this occur already at the state and local level, and that the result is when people come together, the government provides better goods for everyone, and people overcome the psychology that says, I depend on my self-esteem on the false and malign idea that I am necessarily better than all the members of another group, right? And at some level, that there's a nagging doubt that that just can't be right. And that once we begin to think of ourselves and our esteem, our contribution to society, not as being racially specific and secured, but as being the product of our own efforts and responsibility, we in fact become more secure in self-esteem, less likely to succumb to deaths of despair, and at the same time, perhaps there's greater latitude for freedom in the way in which we think our identities in a society that is a little bit less racially organized. And so all of that to say, and I'll go a little bit more into some of the details, some of the narratives, some of the stories when we get together next week. I think McKee's excursion helps us to see that there is signs of progress being made in 21st century America. Sometimes it's hard to see in our national politics. Things are so fractious, so mean, so polarized, so destructive in many ways. But that when we look more at the local, we might just see greater signs for hope and optimism. And paying attention to that level may help us to ultimately reset our national politics as well. All right, to be continued, but I hope you're beginning to see why it is I'm bringing these two books together and suggesting that they have some hopeful message for us. I want to wish everybody again a happy Thanksgiving. Have good weeks, and I'll look forward to being back with you again next week. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.